to the Extraordinary Kids Summit. I'm Trish Keiller, and so grateful that you're tuning in today on this last day of the Extraordinary Kids Summit. For the past 3 weeks, we've been checking in with some thought leaders in the field, and today, to be honest, is a mix of emotions for me, which has sort of been the theme partially of this summit, in a lot of intense emotions during this time. I'm so sad to see it come to an end, as I've gotten so much pleasure and joy out of speaking with the speakers and engaging with all of you. I'm also a little tired, so I'm looking forward to a little bit of a slower pace with my daughter and my husband here. I'm so grateful. And today, I just have something so personal to share with you, because today I'm bringing you my teacher and my mentor, Leah Kalish. Hi, Leah.
Hi.
Thanks so much for being here. So 14 years ago, I left teaching outside of Hartford, Connecticut to come and train with Leah. And that was in 2006. And so my intention was to go back to Connecticut, and I never did that, but I love you, Connecticut, and I'm still here. And so since 2006, Leah has really been the force in my life who has equipped me to take all of the things that we've really learned over the past 3 weeks and really integrate them and embody them on such a deep, deep, deep level that I could not share her with you. It brings me some vulnerability. I'm wondering how this will go, because it's so personal for me, but I also know that our greatest opportunities to deepen and see ourselves is in a vulnerable space, and to be curious. And when we go into that space, it's enabled me to do this. So on the first day, Dr. Mark Brackett, when he spoke about the smartest people often don't realize their dreams because we get too caught up in the emotion and in our own way. And so I'm certainly not one of those smart people, but the work with Leah has enabled me to do what I want to do in the world, and that is to help kids feel better. So as this work has meant so much to me, and it's equipped me to be able to be a better teacher, a better wife, a better mother, sister, a better daughter. And I'm just so grateful to Leah to be able to be here today and to share this work with you. And Leah, who's got so much experience in this work, she does so many things, but she is a family constellation facilitator. She's an embodiment process, what's the right word? Practitioner. And she's worked all over the place, integrating yoga and mindfulness into schools through Yoga Ed and Move With Me and Sports Specialty. She's nationally recognized for her work in the world, but so importantly to me, like, she's touched me in a way that I've never been touched before. So Leah, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure. That was quite an introduction. But I think it segues us right into what I would add, is that I think that you're acknowledging me for supporting you in going deeper with yourself, knowing more about yourself, so you can actually be more you and less coming from an unconscious place of some other sort of thought or imprint or past experience that's filtering into the present.
Yeah.
So just to explain, the family constellation work is around addressing current issues through looking at where they may be really rooted in systemic or family trauma. Mm-hmm. So the work of epigenetics, supported by neuroscience, has shown us now that even trauma that happened to your grandmother or mother often shows up in you, right? In issues that you think are about you, but really they're incomplete emotion that is still unprocessed from someone. Just to give you a simple example, they did this study with rats, and they shocked rats in the presence of the smell of cherry blossoms. And then they would bring the smell of cherry blossoms into the next generation. They'd have a stress or a terror response. The next generation, 5 generations of mice whose, whatever that is, great grandparents were shocked with the smell of cherry blossoms, reacted to that smell, right, in their nervous system like something bad was going to happen. So that just gives you a little idea. We don't think about that so much. Like, we know, my grandmother's mother died really young, or she had 3 miscarriages, or we don't realize, in the thinking of like rise above and move forward, the emotional impact of trauma is great. And until it's completed, it carries forward.
Yeah. And I think, it's so interesting. And there's this cliche that we say all the time, and just be you, just be like the best you. And I know there's a book called This Thing Called You, and I forget who the author is, but I remember reading going like, well, how do I want to be me? But there were pieces that just felt
right.
that was so hard to do. And so for me, and I'll just sort of share, some of the trauma, if you will, like that word is so packed and it seems so traumatic sometimes when we use that word. But for me, I had a pretty straightforward family together, and both my parents and 4 kids, and everybody really healthy and happy and successful. And there was a piece that I couldn't really understand what was like in the way. And underneath, this work with you, I came to, grief and loss that was like way back in my system. And I know you'll talk about this later.
So that people understand, not in your system. It lived in your system, but it was from your family system.
Got it. Right, yeah. Right. And so how that sort of played out in my life was like holding me back from like making decisions or like doing things. And I couldn't really figure out what that was. And even though my mom experienced a lot of loss and grief, she didn't walk around as if she experienced loss and grief. She was so successful and so happy and the biggest hugger. But there was a part of me that felt that something I was always trying to navigate around, but it was nothing that was spoken. And so as the entry into this work, it just allowed me to be able to to see that, and it freed me up in such a crazy way. So tell us a little bit more specifically, like inherited family trauma, like what is it? And then can you give us like some examples, because sometimes we think about trauma in a very big way.
Trauma, I would define as any event or ongoing events, right? Sometimes it's a way of being or the circumstances of your life that bring up such big emotions that they're not processed as it's happening, right? So they're what we call incomplete. And everybody knows completion, right? You have like a falling out with a friend, and either you finally come together and you work that out, or you don't and you leave each other. But if you walk into the same room 10 years later, boom, right? All those feelings are still there. So incomplete means that there are still feelings, right, that haven't disappeared into understanding and back to neutral. So when big events happen, loss of a parent, loss of a child, loss of a country, right? Loss of a sibling, suicide, accidents, loss of livelihood, all these things, right? We cope with and we keep moving forward. And you might even know, you knew the story of your grandmother, right? Yeah. You know the story, but we don't connect how we're responding to something. And maybe it's easier if I use an example from my own life, which is why one of the reasons I got into this work. And I'm going to speak to, before I give the example, mostly the things that show up, right, as we don't quite understand what that is, or it's something about me, or it's inexplicable, or you can't work through it, or it keeps recurring. these are all, the places where you are disempowered are usually places where whatever the issue is rooted in something that's not just you. And until you basically differentiate yourself and your feelings from the feelings of others, you don't have any traction around that. So for example, my grandmother's first child was died the same day she was born. Tragic, right? Now, my grandparents went on to have 4 other children, my mother being the third of those 4. But because they never spoke about their daughter who died, that child's siblings didn't know about her. And yet my mother, what I realized doing this work, was what we call unconsciously identified, right? So if you exclude someone who belongs in a family system, even if they only lived a day, right, they have their place. That child was my grandparents' first child. But because she was excluded in the heart, what happens, we see energetically over and over and over, and exclusion creates an unconscious identification. So my mother was unconsciously identified, carried the feelings of that excluded child. She never felt seen. She even tried to kill herself when she was 18 years old, but she had, like you, a wonderful life. Everybody's happy and healthy, it didn't make any sense. So, that's the kind of thing that shows up. She feels like the child that wasn't seen, even though she was a child who was being seen.
Right.
And until, and then of course that had impact on me. And until I could see that bigger picture, I didn't have a good relationship with my mother. That's one of the reasons I did this work. And I also had infertility issues, right? For heaven forbid, I would get pregnant and then lose my first child. And even when I finally had my son, when he was first born, I'd have these like weird PTSD, like I'd be holding him and all of a sudden in front of my eyes, there'd be this flash of him just disappearing. And I was like, what is going on? So the family constellation work, I was driven by my own like inexplicable sort of issues. And it was like a revelation, like, oh my God, this stuff isn't mine.
Yeah.
And also it helped me do 3 things. One, start to see, see what's occurring from a health paradigm as opposed to a pathology paradigm. We experience it as something that's wrong. Yeah. Right. And then we try to focus on the thing itself. But if you are looking through a health paradigm, you realize something's arising that needs to be seen and heard and is showing us, right, that something in the bigger picture is unconscious or needs to be separated or needs to come together or something, right? So that in that way you receive your own symptoms and, as you say, with curiosity, your own children, your students, like what's really going on there? And so asking about family history becomes a lot more significant. Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully people can connect dots.
Yeah. And I would say, that piece that you spoke about in the bigger picture, because for me entering that work, right, there's this notion around like issues, right? Like what are your issues? What's your baggage? Like this sort of whole thing that gets wrapped around just negativity, or like that you're trying to fix all these things that are wrong with you. And so one of the greatest pieces of this work for me was orienting to this health paradigm that you're talking about, because on top of understanding like the grief, then there was guilt that I could be like looking at my mom through that lens, or that I was having these challenges because of unexpressed grief or something, right? And so that then obviously that doesn't help, right? These meta emotions on top of them. And so orienting to this health paradigm. So talk to us a little bit more about the health paradigm and like what that really means to orient ourselves in that way.
Okay, well, to explain that, I'm going to just speak briefly to why I integrate both the family constellation work and the embodied somatic embodiment process work. Because what I see, like all of this stuff lives in our bodies. So when you do a family constellation and you work with how people hold their families. So for example, anyone listening, if I ask you to take 3 objects and just show me a picture of like how it was when you were a kid, like where you would be, where your mother would be, where your father would be, from wherever you put those, right? And there's no obviously right or wrong answer. It just shows in a way that you've probably never expressed how it is for you. Mm-hmm. That shape and where people are facing and looking, and I would know a lot about you. So one of the things at the family constellation work, it allows people to see how they are holding their system and how that could be blocking their own sort of like vitality and relationship to life and love flowing in a healthy way through the system, the family system, just the same way you need it to flow through your own body. Yeah. And when you can sort of put that in a healthier configuration with the proper order, right? Energy flows differently in you, to you, right? It's not what happens to you, it's how you hold it. And how you hold it takes energy, and it also affects your own energy and vitality. So first is helping people get into a healthy place within their own family system, right? Which is often, and I've never met anyone who didn't have some kind of entanglement with incomplete issues within their family, right? For their, parents, grandparents. And then the embodiment work is about really supporting someone in completing those imprints as they're held in the body. And we all know from doing yoga, doing mindfulness, meditating, how when you get into that field where everything can just be as it is, and you can start to see your own thoughts about things and uncouple thought from sensation or emotion, right? And let things just be and complete. You might cry, you might shake, you might just see something and right? And there's a lot of completion. There's a lot of metabolism of mental, emotional material. So the embodiment process is just a deeper, more embodied experience and process around completing your own imprints, which are sort of configurations of incomplete mental, emotional material. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I would say that what was so powerful for me when we talk about the health paradigm was, and not necessarily like talking it all out, right, and trying to understand it, was that it was all in service of love. Yes. And it really, right, like the grief it's in service of love, right? The unexpressed grief is in service of love, of trying to take care of your kids when you don't have time to grieve, right? And so just being able to see it that way was transformational. Yes. And allowed me to, just see my life in a very different way. Although, I've said this before, but it wouldn't really look like from the outside that people would say there was a change, right? It was like Eckhart Tolle, when he says, go through these huge transformations, people are like, oh, you're exactly the same, right? You're like, what? No, I'm not, right? There's been so much shift, but we don't always go to that level. It may not look different on the outside, but really you've shifted your experience with like your own life force, with your own relationship to life. I mean, my life doesn't look that different, but man, it feels totally different. So explain the other piece. So the health paradigm was super helpful to me. And then differentiation. So you've brought that up a little bit. We also use that word a lot in schools with reaching individual student needs, but this is like on a deeper level. Can you talk a little bit more into like what that really means, and like how we do that, how that serves us to really differentiate what's ours and what's not? Yeah, that the differentiation, I feel like is an ongoing process that
goes along with growing up and individuating, right? Because, right, we understand we're looking to our caregivers, right? We're in a field that's way more merged when we're little, and then we're separating. But often those imprints are how, the relationship with our mother, right, sets up lots of basically, habits and ways of relating and how you're mirrored. I mean, we know all about that, about attachment and development, et cetera. So when these things that show up, and you get to work on them for yourself in the family constellation work, it starts to really get clear. Oh, that's what happened to my mother. Yeah. And those are her feelings. And you get clearer because it's slowed down and you're more in your body, like, oh, but these are mine. Not that, there wasn't an impact of that, but you're now not entangled. Like your intelligence, your health intelligence, right, that can heal you when you get sick and heal your bones when you break them, etc., knows what's yours and what's not yours. And when you can use your mindfulness and meditation practice in an embodied way to actually allow that to happen, because you have a clearer picture, right, of where things belong, you're able to then be with what's just yours, and inside of that differentiation, complete the material that's yours. Mm-hmm. It's when it's still merged with somebody else's, you can't complete it, because you can never do that for somebody else. Yeah. Right? And we all have our own separate journeys.
Yeah. And so often, like you said, it's just unknown. It's under the surface and you can't get. And so for me, like my example, in relationship, and then, right, deciding to get married and then not getting married and not getting married, and like connecting like these dots on connecting that to loss, that I would get married and then I would lose my husband or something like that was there. And it was unexplainable.
Interrupt just so that listeners understand that, since you were specific, your grandmother lost her husband after 3 years with 2 young children.
Yeah.
Right. So, right, your mother was that young child. Yeah. And she grew up with a mother really not knowing anything, but that mother who'd lost her husband. And now she goes on, has life, but you, right, every time you think about getting married, all this fear, all this and then you make reasons for it not to be a good idea, until you go deeper into that fear and realize, oh, this is the unexpressed fear of your grandmother, of your mother, that still lives in this, was too much at the time to even complete. And everybody had to move on and take care of kids. And so now in the bigger system, you see how the health operates. It's always going to complete and bring itself back to health. Mm-hmm. And you were willing to receive it in that way and look at how come I get in great relationships with great guys, but when it comes to taking that step, I can't do it.
Right.
But you see how then your completion of that and your individual, your differentiation from that and completion of that both honored your grandmother and your mother, mm-hmm. right? And allowed you to more deeply individuate and do it differently. So you see how the health is really always operating.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I love that word that helped keep me so much in the process, because that guilt was heavy of that there was something wrong with my grandmother or my mother. But that word honor.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I can talk while she cries for a second.
I know, because she knows what I'm going to say anyway.
It's true for all of us. That really, as parents, all we want is for our children to be well and do well. We have no idea of the kind of stuff that they've taken on, because we're not in touch with our incomplete stuff. Right. And we're now also the children of parents, and we can have complaints about them. But when you see the bigger picture, oh, that's what they were carrying, right? And that's what they were expressing. And now I'm on some level expressing that. But when you really individuate and differentiate, you can love them by being well and doing well, and plugging into their love for you and not their incomplete wounds. And that feels fantastic and really opens up possibilities for you, but also a completely new depth in your relationship with your parent, because you're no longer the child, right, who's unconsciously trying to take care of them, or, you know.
Right. Yeah, and the truth, the truth of the matter is they
don't want you to, and they don't know you're doing it.
They do all of that stuff so that you can step in to do stuff that, like for me, doing the summit, just such vulnerability, but that without that work, I wouldn't be able to do it, right? But this is what why they were doing that, so that we could, right? And I'll continue to try to do things so that my daughter, right? So that we can serve each other and not like stay small, because it's a little more comfortable. So,
and you don't even know you're staying small. You're just staying in an imprint that you haven't named yet and differentiated from. Mm-hmm. And everyone starts small and looks to their caregivers, right, as their life and their needs are met and their whatever. And then most of us, right, most of us are doing some level of work, but the family constellation work really helps you take a giant step in shifting from unconscious ways of relating to the world and to others via imprints that were laid down via when you were little with your parents.
Yeah, and thank you for making that distinction, because I wasn't meaning small as like bad or something, but that we could express ourselves, right? When people are like, well, just be you. Like, yep. We want to be us. We want to be ourselves. And sometimes it feels hard to be able to do that.
Yes, and a very common dynamic is people not doing or having more than their parents. Sometimes a way of unconsciously loving is to not have more, especially if your parents had some issues around not being enough or not making enough or whatever.
Yeah.
So, like, there's lots of these unconscious ways of loving that don't serve us.
Right. So in the last part here, can you talk to us a little bit, like you mentioned the embodiment process, but like how do we do that? Like, what are some things that we could do to like sit that way? If we have a meditation practice, or if you're just beginning, like, how do you start to embody some of that?
Well, often in meditation, there's this way of thinking that you're somehow rising above, or sort of moving up and out, like higher consciousness separates us, mm-hmm. right, from our physical experience. And really, we live in this world, and we embody infinite intelligence that's way beyond our consciousness. I mean, you don't know how you actually, right, think of what your health system is doing for you in the background all the time. Yep. And how it does all of those things. So the embodiment process is more about somatic presence. You want to actually feel the floor, feel your sit bones, come down. And your nervous system, I think, Dr. Melrose probably talked about this. Your nervous system likes that. Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't want to go up and out. It wants to come down and in and root and widen and rest back and receive. Mm-hmm. And the more we do that somatically in the present moment, right, the softer you get, the slower, the more fluid. And in the embodied work, I often use fluid as the image and the way to orient to yourself, because you are 75-80% fluid. Yeah. All that health intelligence, all your metabolism, all your nutrients, etc. It's all right in the fluid, right? Without that, we couldn't live. So orienting to the fluid rather than your structure or your thought of yourself or your posture, letting all of that go and really softening and widening and letting the fluid do you and letting it show you and just being with the sensations that arise in a neutral way. Right? And so that you can, in that neutrality and that experience of just sensation as a sensation, you're not going, oh, I'm relaxed. You're actually going, oh, my sit bones feel like they're sinking, but my left one is a little bit higher than my right. You get real neutral, specific, just the sensation, no emotional interpretation. Right, which is already going to take you into some level of imprint, right, where thought and sensation and interpretation and emotion are all sort of gathered in like a, a name, relaxed, right? So when you train yourself to get out of that, more and more can happen for you. More thought and sensation are uncoupled because most of us are organized in some way around what we couldn't be with, or what our system knew would be overwhelming for us. So it's holding for us. When we were little and, right, mom went into the hospital or whatever, right? There's a part of us that probably still lives in us some way, right? So now when we start to feel someone's leaving, we go into a thing. Right? But if you can really be with that sensation of rising energy and not make it mean anything and let it be slowed down in the fluids, the thought, oh, I'm not okay, or I'm going to die, or I'm never going to see her again, it uncouples from that sensation and the sensation can complete. And then you don't have to respond, right, in that same way. And you get more available for your own resilience, your own metabolism, your own ability to be with and complete the things, right, that happen to you.
Yeah. And share with us just lastly, like when the orientation to the space versus the stuff and like sitting was so powerful for me. Can you just share a little bit about why that's so helpful?
Well, because I think it allows greater wholeness. I mean, in the examples that I just gave, orienting to the fluid rather than your structure, right? Because most of the time people go somatic and they start, you feel your bones or your structure, but then you want to keep letting go of all of those ideas in your head, right? And really letting the right brain fluid, which is where you came from, right? Do that. So one of the things, even in just looking around the room, when you include the space of the room and not just the objects in the room, right? It automatically will shift your body, your experience into a more slowed down wholeness. Mm-hmm. And in that wholeness, there's a deeper experience of health, right? And we all get so caught up in our minds that our thoughts, right, arise from the fluid and return to the fluid. Our emotions do too. So it's sort of like, we get so caught up in the thing, but we are not seeing at the invisible forces that are driving that. Mm-hmm. Right? So when you include both, it's easier to then orient, as they say in the mindfulness people, the wholeness, like what's holding all of that. Yeah. Right? It's not just a relationship of two, there's always a greater whole holding that relationship.
Like usual, I'm speechless after you say something.
Well, but that's good in that clearly what I'm saying is helping you become more embodied. And when you do that and you orient in that way, there's a deeper intelligence that you're also in touch with. Mm-hmm. That's way smarter than your thoughts.
Yeah.
Mind, right? You see what I'm saying? And often when I work with people, once they start to slow down and orient in this different way to the fluid, to the health, to the great, to the wholeness, what they see is how much of their lives they kind of make happen from their thoughts about what they think should happen, rather than letting, what feels right, what builds potency in them to sort of arise as something, that they really want to do, or that they really care about, or that they really choose for themselves right now. Their life has been so kind of dictated from above by what they think is the right thing, that they get disconnected from what's right from inside them. That's a much better keep you on track, keep you in your own authenticity and health and what's really right for you in the moment, right? So that's one of the shifts that happen when you get into a healthier configuration with your own family system, and then orient to your own system as this source of health and intelligence, rather than something that your brain is dictating to.
Right. It's great.
And I think that I just want to say to you, especially, I'm so proud of you. I just want to acknowledge you for what you're bringing to the education world. Right? I was in that, bringing yoga and mindfulness, and, now I've moved on to doing this individual work, because it's so important to me to support people like you in going deeper in yourselves, so that you can bring that into the system, because we teach who we are.
Yeah.
And you are in this different resonance with your own health and with your own deeper intelligence. The field that you hold and who you are and what you model for others is so much more. And I see that in you. I acknowledge that in you. It really just really makes me want to cry too.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. So tell us, for people who are interested, how they could learn a little bit more with you.
You can go to my website, leahkalish.com. And on there too, my husband and I, because my husband and I do the family constellation work together whenever we can. We were trained together by Mark Wallin. He has a great book, if you're interested more in this systemic trauma, inherited trauma work, called It Didn't Start With You. Again, It Didn't Start With You. His name is Mark Wallin. And Bruce and I are going to do a free online introduction to this work on June 17th, I think from like 1 to 3, but it'll be on my website, leahkalish.com.
Okay, great. And there's a link you can check right there to access that.
You can call me, write to me, yeah. I'm here for you. It's thrilling to me that educators care about this stuff.
Well, Leah, I mean, thank you doesn't cover it ever, but thank you so much for showing up, for sharing, for speaking so authentically, obviously for the, just huge impact in my life that you've been and you will continue to be. I know that as we get into this, there's it's like an onion, right? Layers keep coming and we discover new stuff, but with a sense of health and curiosity that just frees us up and essentially allows, at least for me, to enjoy the world and in a way that I really want to. So thank you from the bottom of my heart so much.
You're so welcome. It's really been a pleasure.
And thank you everyone for tuning in over the past 3 weeks. I've so appreciated your engagement. I know that you've gotten a lot out of all of the speakers, and continue to engage with me and the community, and everyone stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll get out of this together. We will. Okay, bye-bye everyone.